The year I turned 53, I spent 11 months assigned to a maritime incident investigation unit that most people in the service didn't know existed. This was 2008. The unit operated out of a repurposed Coast Guard administrative building in Norfolk, Virginia, not the wilderness, not even close. Our job was to review cases where fatalities or disappearances on federally managed waterways had produced conflicting accounts between agencies: Park Service, Forest Service, Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife, Coast Guard, sometimes Bureau of Land Management if a reservoir was involved. When the official narratives didn't match, we were the ones who got sent to sit in windowless rooms and read paperwork until they did. It was not glamorous work. Most of the cases were resolved inside of a week, a jurisdictional miscommunication here, a filing error there. Occasionally a genuine dispute over where a drowning had technically occurred relative to some invisible boundary line on the water. I'd taken the assignment because my knees were giving me trouble, and my supervisor had quietly suggested I consider a year of desk work before I did something irreversible to them on a mountainside. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd be back in the field by the following spring. I was 5 months into the rotation when the Harkin file landed on my desk. If you're the kind of person who listens to these stories, and I imagine you are, or you wouldn't be here, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you'd think, and I've got no shortage of incidents left to tell. The file came in as a referral from the National Park Service's Southeast Regional Office. A seasonal ranger named Ethan Harkin, age 29, had gone missing on November 14, 2007, during a backcountry patrol in the southern section of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. His body had been recovered 17 days later in a drainage approximately 4 miles from his last confirmed position. The official cause of death was hypothermia secondary to navigational disorientation. In plain language, they were saying he got lost, got cold, and died. The reason the file had been forwarded to our unit was a 7-page letter written by Harkin's patrol partner, a permanent ranger named Dana Cortland. Dana Cortland had 19 years with the Park Service, 14 of them in the Smokies. She had worked with Harkin for 2 full seasons, and her letter, addressed to the regional director with copies sent to the superintendent's office and the chief ranger, stated in measured but unambiguous language that the official finding was not merely incomplete, it was structurally impossible. Her objections were specific. First, she stated that Harkin had grown up in Sevier County, less than 20 miles from the park boundary. He had hiked the southern Smokies since childhood. He held a degree in forestry from the University of Tennessee. He had been hired specifically because of his familiarity with that section of the backcountry. Navigational disorientation, she wrote, would be like saying a mail carrier got lost on his own route. Second, she noted that Harkin had been carrying a GPS unit, a compass, a detailed topographic map, and a park-issued radio. None of those items were found with his body. His day pack was recovered 2 miles from his remains, partially buried under leaf litter, with the radio still inside, but the GPS, compass, and map were gone. The incident report attributed this to the pack becoming separated during a fall. Cortland pointed out that the pack's main zipper was closed, its contents dry and organized. If Harkin had tumbled and lost the pack, the contents would have shown it. Third, and this was the detail that had triggered the referral, she stated that the drainage where Harkin's body was found was in the opposite direction from every destination on his patrol route. Not adjacent, not a plausible wrong turn, the opposite direction. She included a hand-drawn map overlay showing his assigned route, the location of his last radio contact, and the recovery site. The geometry didn't describe a man getting lost. It described a man going somewhere he had no professional reason to go. The regional office had reviewed her letter, conducted a brief internal inquiry, and concluded that Cortland's objections, while understandable given her personal relationship with the deceased, did not rise to the level of evidentiary contradiction. The finding stood. Cortland had then filed a formal appeal, which had been denied. She had requested an independent review, which had been declined. And then, 6 months after Harkin's death, someone in the regional office I never learned who had quietly forwarded the entire package to our unit in Norfolk, with a handwritten note clipped to the front page that said only, "Might warrant a second look." I read the file 3 times on the first day. The incident report was thorough in the way that reports are thorough when someone has taken care to answer every question that could be asked and none that should be. The medical examiner's findings were consistent with hypothermia. The toxicology was clean. The search timeline was documented in detail. 22 searchers, 3 dog teams, a helicopter with FLIR. Everything procedurally correct, but Cortland's letter kept pulling me back. She wasn't emotional in it. That was what struck me. I'd read hundreds of statements from grieving colleagues, and most of them leaned on feeling, on character testimony, on the insistence that the person they'd lost was too good, too careful, too experienced for whatever the official report claimed. Cortland didn't do that. She wrote like someone building a case. Every sentence contained either a fact or a direct reference to the evidentiary record. She cited page numbers from the incident report. She quoted the radio log. She included GPS coordinates for the recovery site and calculated the bearing and distance from Harkin's last known position to the nearest point on his assigned route. The math didn't work. That was her central point. Not that the explanation was emotionally unsatisfying, but that it was geometrically false. I brought the file to my unit supervisor, a retired Forest Service investigator named Len Paulson. Len was 61 years old, had spent 30 years investigating everything from timber theft to backcountry homicides, and possessed the rare ability to read a 600-page case file and tell you in one sentence whether it was worth pursuing. He read Cortland's letter in my office, turned to the map overlay, and sat with it for almost a full minute. "The pack location," he said. "I know. 2 miles from the body. Main zipper closed, contents organized, radio still inside. And the GPS, compass, and map all missing." Len set the letter down. A man doesn't lose his navigation tools and keep his lunch. That was what had been circling in my mind without quite forming into language. Harkin had allegedly become disoriented and wandered 4 miles in the wrong direction. But the items you'd need to prevent that exact outcome were the only items missing, and the items you wouldn't need, the radio, the first aid kit, the food, the rain jacket, were all neatly stored in the pack he had supposedly lost in a fall. "You want to go down there?" Len said. It wasn't a question. Someone should talk to Cortland in person. The regional office already reviewed her claims. The regional office reviewed her letter. Nobody reviewed her evidence. Len looked at me for a long moment. He had the expression he always wore when he was weighing whether a case had enough substance to justify the paperwork. "You've got 2 weeks of accrued field time. Use 5 of them. If there's nothing there, close it and come back. If there's something, call me before you do anything with it." I flew into Knoxville on a Tuesday in late April 2008, rented a truck, and drove south toward the park. Spring was coming on fast at the lower elevations, dogwood in bloom, the ridges just beginning to show green. But above 4,000 feet, the trees were still bare, and the upper peaks carried the dull gray-brown look of a forest that hadn't quite decided to wake up yet. I'd arranged to meet Dana Cortland at the Oconaluftee Ranger Station on the North Carolina side, but she'd sent word through the dispatch office that she'd prefer to meet at a trailhead called Deep Creek instead. No explanation. I didn't push for one. When a witness chooses the meeting location, there's usually a reason. And the reason usually tells you something. Deep Creek Trailhead sits at the end of a paved road just outside Bryson City. It's a popular access point in summer families, tubers, casual hikers. But in late April, on a weekday afternoon, the parking area held exactly 2 vehicles, my rental and a green park service truck that had seen better years. Dana Cortland was leaning against the tailgate when I pulled in. She was maybe 5'6", lean in the way that people get when they spend more time walking than sitting. With short brown hair going gray at the temples and the kind of direct, unhurried gaze that told me she'd already decided several things about this meeting before I arrived. She wore a park uniform, but no badge. I learned later she'd been placed on administrative assignment and was no longer authorized to carry one. I introduced myself, showed my credentials, and explained the scope of my review. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. "You came from Norfolk," she said when I finished. "Yes. 5 months after my last appeal was denied. The referral took time to reach us. I can't speak to the delay." She studied me, not with hostility, but with the careful assessment of someone who has been disappointed by institutions enough times to calibrate her expectations precisely. "You read the full file?" "3 times. "And the incident report?" "Yes." "Did anything in the incident report strike you as unusual?" I could have given a diplomatic answer. I could have said I was there to gather information, not to share preliminary impressions. That would have been the procedurally correct response. But I'd driven 3 hours to meet a woman who had spent 6 months trying to get someone to look at her evidence. And I judged that diplomacy would cost me more than it saved. "The pack," I said. 2 miles from the body. Zipper closed. Contents organized. Navigation tools missing. Everything else present. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief, something closer to recognition. The look of a person who has been speaking a language no one around them understands and has just heard someone use the correct word. "Follow me," she said. She drove, and I followed. We went north on the main park road for about 12 miles, then turned onto an unmarked gravel spur that climbed steeply through a hardwood forest so dense that the afternoon light dropped to something close to twilight within the first quarter mile. The road was maintained, but barely potholes patched with gravel. Drainage cuts showing erosion, the kind of surface that tells you a road crew comes through once a year and hopes for the best. After roughly 4 miles, we reached a small turnaround where the gravel ended and the forest simply began. No gate, no signage. Just the road, stopping and the woods starting, as if the two had reached an agreement about territory. Cortland parked and waited for me at the edge of the tree line. When I joined her, she handed me a photocopied topographic map, not a standard park trail map, but a full USGS quad with hand-drawn annotations in 2 different ink colors. "Blue is Ethan's assigned patrol route for November 14th, she said. "Red is the actual path his evidence describes." I studied the map. The blue line ran roughly northwest from the trailhead along a maintained trail for 2 miles, then branched onto an unmaintained route that followed a ridge before descending into a creek drainage where Harkin was supposed to check a series of water quality monitoring stations. Standard backcountry work. The route made a rough loop and returned to the trailhead. Total distance, maybe 11 miles. A full day's work, but not a difficult one for someone who knew the terrain. The red line started on the same trail, but approximately 1 mile in, it diverged sharply to the southeast off-trail, downhill, through terrain that the contour lines described as steep, heavily forested, and cut by multiple small drainages. The red line terminated at an X that Cortland had labeled with a date and a set of coordinates. "That X is where they found him," I said. November 30th, 17 days after his last radio contact. I looked at the map again. The blue route and the red route shared their first mile. After that, they moved in almost perfectly opposite directions. If Harkin had simply made a wrong turn, you'd expect the two lines to share a longer segment, or to diverge at a trail junction, or to follow roughly parallel terrain. This wasn't a wrong turn. This was a complete reversal of direction through trackless forest. "What's down there?" I asked, pointing to the X. That's what I've been trying to get someone to answer for 6 months. She said it without bitterness, but the weight was there. The drainage where they found him is called Stillhouse Branch. It's not on any trail map. It's not part of any patrol route. There's no monitoring equipment down there, no historical structures, no research sites. I've been in this park for 14 years, and I've never had a professional reason to go into Stillhouse Branch. Neither did Ethan. Could he have been following an animal? A wounded bear? An elk? In November? Possible. But he didn't radio it in. Ethan radioed everything. That was one of his... She stopped herself, recalibrated. Standard protocol for backcountry rangers encountering wildlife requiring intervention is to report the sighting and request guidance before deviating from the assigned route. Ethan followed protocol. Always. I noted the correction. She'd started to say something personal, and pulled it back into professional language. That told me two things. She was aware of how personal attachment could be used to discredit her, and she'd been practicing the discipline of separating what she knew from what she felt. "Walk me through November 14th, I said. She did, from memory, without notes, with the kind of detail that comes from having replayed a sequence so many times, it's become architecture. Harkin had checked in at the Oconaluftee dispatch at 06:45. Cortland was on a separate assignment that day, trail maintenance assessment, on a different section of the park, so they weren't patrolling together. Harkin signed out a vehicle, drove to this trailhead, and began his route at approximately 07:30. He made a scheduled radio check at 0900 from a point roughly 1 mile up the trail, the point where the blue and red lines on her map still overlapped. His transmission was routine. Weather was clear, temperature around 40 degrees, winds light. He reported no issues. He was supposed to check in again at noon. He didn't. Dispatch tried to raise him at 12:15. No response. They tried again at 12:30. Nothing. By 1300, the chief ranger had been notified. By 1400, a hasty search team was being organized. By nightfall, 6 rangers were on the trail with headlamps. They searched his assigned route first, Cortland said. All of it. Every station, every junction, every drainage crossing. Nothing. No sign of him anywhere on the blue line. The pack was found the next morning by a dog team, approximately 1 mile southeast of the trail junction, where the blue and red lines diverged. It was sitting upright at the base of a tulip poplar, leaning against the trunk as if it had been set down. Not thrown, I said. Not thrown, not dropped, set down. The dog handler noted it in his report. I have a copy. The incident report says it was found partially buried under leaf litter. It was, but leaf litter in November in the Smokies accumulates fast. A pack sitting on the ground for 18 hours would show some leaf cover. That's not evidence of a fall. That's evidence of a stationary object in autumn. She was right. I'd seen the same thing 1,000 times in the field. Leave a piece of gear on the forest floor overnight, and it starts to disappear under the ongoing business of the woods. When did they expand the search to the southeast? Not until day 4. The initial search focused on the assigned route and the terrain immediately adjacent. Standard protocol. You search the planned route first, then expand concentrically. The problem was that nobody had reason to look southeast. There was nothing down there. No trail, no destination, no logical reason for him to go that direction. So, what changed on day 4? One of the dog teams got a hit. Tracking dog, not cadaver. Live scent trail leading southeast from the pack location, downhill, into the Stillhouse Branch drainage. A live scent trail 17 days before recovery. No, this was on day 4 of the search, November 18th. The dog picked up a trail that appeared to lead from the pack deeper into the drainage. The handler followed it for approximately 2 miles before the dog lost the scent at a creek crossing. And the body was found another 2 miles past that. Roughly 12 days later, a FLIR pass from the helicopter picked up a thermal anomaly in the lower drainage. They sent a ground team in and found him. I stopped. A thermal anomaly from a body that had been dead for over 2 weeks in November temperatures. Cortland looked at me the way you look at someone who has just arrived at the question you've been waiting for. The incident report describes the FLIR signature as consistent with residual solar heating of a dark surface in a sheltered drainage. Ethan was wearing a dark green jacket. And you don't accept that explanation. The recovery was conducted at 06:30 on November 30th. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge. The drainage was in full shadow. There was no solar heating. I raised this with the search commander. He told me that thermal signatures can persist for hours under certain conditions. They can, I said, but not in the way you're describing. No, she said, not in the way I'm describing. We stood at the edge of the forest for a long time without speaking. The afternoon light had gone golden through the canopy, and somewhere upslope, a wood thrush was working through its song, that liquid, unhurried phrase that sounds like the forest thinking out loud. I want to see the drainage, I said. I know. That's why I brought you here. She reached into the bed of her truck and pulled out 2 day packs. One was hers, already loaded. The other she handed to me. I packed it this morning. Water, first aid, rain layer, headlamp. The drainage is 4 miles from here and the terrain is steep. We'll be back before dark if we leave now. I looked at the pack, then at her. There was a protocol question here. I was an investigator reviewing a closed case, not a field ranger on assignment. And entering rugged backcountry on the word of a single witness who was currently under administrative review was exactly the kind of decision that would look questionable in a report. I knew that. She knew that. But she also knew what I'd already figured out. The answers weren't in the file. The file had been written to close the case, and it had succeeded. Whatever Cortland wanted me to see was in the drainage, and if I drove back to Norfolk without seeing it, I'd spend the rest of my career wondering whether the geometry on that map was right. I shouldered the pack. Lead the way, I said. The first mile was on a maintained trail wide enough for 2. Good footing, moderate uphill grade through a mixed hardwood forest that was just beginning to leaf out. Cortland set a pace that was deliberate without being rushed. The kind of walking rhythm that experienced backcountry people settle into when they know the distance and the daylight and have calculated the margin. We didn't talk much during the climb. She pointed out a few landmarks. A lightning-scarred oak that marked the 1-mile check-in point where Harkin had made his last radio contact. A trail junction where the maintained path branched toward the ridge. A small spring that seeped from a rock face and crossed the trail in a sheet of water so thin it looked like the ground was sweating. At the junction, instead of following the maintained trail northwest, the blue line on her map, she turned southeast onto what was barely a game trail. The canopy closed in immediately. Rhododendron thickets pressed from both sides, and the slope steepened enough that I had to watch my footing on the leaf litter. "This is where his route would have diverged," she said, "if the red line is accurate. You've walked this before. 4 times, twice during the search, twice after. After the case was closed, after my appeal was denied, I came back on my own time." That carried weight. A ranger walking into the backcountry alone to retrace a dead colleague's route without authorization, after being told by her institution that her concerns were unfounded. That was either obsession or conviction. I'd spent enough years in the field to know the difference, and Cortland didn't strike me as someone who confused the two. The descent was relentless. Steep, side-hilling across drainages, ducking under deadfall that nobody had ever cleared because nobody had ever had reason to be here. The forest changed character as we dropped the open hardwoods, giving way to dense hemlock and rhododendron. The kind of dark, close understory where the air goes still and the light takes on a greenish cast that makes noon feel like evening. After about 2 miles, I heard water. Not the thin trickle of a seep, but the steady voice of a creek with real volume. We came out of the rhododendron onto a narrow bench above a stream that was running clear and fast over a bed of sandstone and dark shale. "Stillhouse Branch," Cortland said. The drainage was maybe 40 yards wide at this point, steep-walled on both sides, with the creek occupying the center and a narrow strip of flat ground along the southern bank. Hemlock and rhododendron formed a nearly continuous canopy overhead. The light was dim, filtered, the color of old green glass. Even in late April, with the rest of the park surging into spring, this place felt like it existed in a different season. "His pack was found up there," Cortland said, pointing back the way we'd come, upslope. "The scent trail the dog followed comes through this section, and the body was recovered roughly 2 miles downstream, around the next bend and down into the lower drainage." She led me downstream. The bench narrowed, and at points we were walking in the creek itself, the water ankle-deep and surprisingly cold for the elevation. The walls of the drainage steepened. I realized we were entering something close to a gorge, not the dramatic sandstone slots of the Southwest, but a tight V-shaped cut through the mountain's flank where the creek had been working for millennia. And then Cortland stopped. She pointed to a flat section of the bank where the creek made a gentle curve, leaving a small gravel bar exposed along the inside of the bend. The area was maybe 10 feet by 15, sheltered by an overhang of exposed root mass from a massive hemlock growing at the edge of the bank. "This is where they found him," she said. I looked at the site. It was sheltered, protected from wind, close to water. If you were a lost hiker looking for a place to wait for rescue, or a dying man looking for a place to rest, this would be a reasonable choice. The incident report's narrative wasn't impossible, physically. A man could walk here, a man could lie down here, a man could die here. But that wasn't what Cortland had brought me to see. "Look at the ground," she said. I looked. The gravel bar was ordinary water-smoothed stones, silt deposits, the usual detritus of a mountain creek. But along the upper edge of the bar, where the gravel met the soil of the bank, there was a line. Not a natural line, a deliberate one. Someone had arranged stone-smooth, flat creek stones, each one roughly palm-sized in a straight row approximately 8 feet long. The row was precise, evenly spaced, parallel to the water line. "Was this documented?" I asked. "No. This wasn't in the incident report. It wasn't there during the recovery. I came back here 3 weeks after the case was closed. This is what I found. I knelt beside the line of stones. There were 19 of them. Each one was placed flat side up, the gaps between them consistent, about 3 inches. The alignment was close to perfect. This was not the work of water. This was not the work of animals. This was arrangement. Deliberate, careful, patient arrangement. Someone was here after the recovery, I said. Yes. Could it have been another hiker? A memorial? There's no trail within 3 miles of this location. The drainage isn't on any map that a recreational hiker would carry. And a memorial would look like a memorial, a cairn, a cross, initials. This doesn't look like a memorial. She was right. It didn't look like a memorial. It looked like a boundary. I stood up and looked downstream, in the direction the line pointed. The drainage continued, narrowing further, the creek disappearing around another bend where the hemlock canopy was so dense it looked like the entrance to a tunnel. Have you gone further? I asked. Once, after I found the stones. What's down there? Cortland didn't answer immediately. She stood looking at the bend in the creek, her expression not frightened, but concentrated, the way a person looks when they're deciding how much truth a stranger can be trusted with. That's what I need you to see for yourself, she said. We followed the creek downstream. The drainage continued to narrow, the walls steepening on both sides until we were walking in a corridor of rock and root and green shadow no more than 20 feet wide. The hemlock canopy overhead was nearly continuous. What light came through had been filtered so many times it arrived without direction, not falling from above but simply existing in the air, dim and even, like the light inside a church with no windows. The creek itself changed character. Upstream it had been fast and vocal, running over gravel and small ledges with a constant chatter of moving water. Here it went quiet. The bed deepened. The current slowed, and the water turned from clear to something closer to amber, not murky, but tinted, the way water looks when it's been in long contact with tannic soil. The stones on the bottom were darker. The banks were steep-cut, almost vertical, exposing layers of compacted soil and pale root networks that looked like the vascular system of the mountain itself. I've walked a lot of drainages in my career. Hundreds, probably. And what I can tell you is that every drainage has a personality, a way of carrying sound, holding light, moving air. Most of them feel continuous with the forest around them. They're lower, wetter, darker, but they're still part of the same system. Stillhouse Branch didn't feel continuous with anything. It felt like we'd crossed a threshold. I don't mean that in a mystical sense. I mean it in the way a person who has spent decades reading landscapes means it. The vegetation was different, predominantly hemlock and rhododendron, with almost no hardwood understory, which created a monotone quality to the canopy that eliminated the usual visual variety of a mixed southern Appalachian forest. The sound profile was different. The stream was barely audible. The birds had stopped. And there was a particular quality of silence that I associate with extremely sheltered terrain where air movement is negligible. And the temperature had dropped, noticeably, by what I estimated was 8 or 10 degrees from the bench where we'd entered the drainage. These were all explicable. Hemlock-dominated north-facing drainages in the Smokies commonly create their own microclimate. Cold air pools, limited sun exposure suppresses growth of deciduous species. The effect can be dramatic. I knew all of that. But there was something else, and this is harder to describe without sounding like I'm editorializing. So I'll just say it plainly. The drainage felt attentive. That's the best word I have. Not hostile, not welcoming. Attentive, the way a room feels when someone is in it but hasn't spoken yet. Cortland walked ahead of me without talking. Her pace had slowed, and I noticed she was placing her feet carefully, not in the way you do on difficult terrain, but in the way you do when you're trying not to disturb something. I didn't comment on it. I just matched her pace and kept looking. After about a quarter mile past the stone line, the drainage bent sharply to the south and widened into a small amphitheater, a bowl-shaped depression, perhaps 50 yards across, where the creek split around a low, flat island of dark soil and moss. The walls of the amphitheater rose steeply on 3 sides, covered in rhododendron so thick that the individual plants had fused into a single mass of twisted wood and dark leaves. The canopy here was lower, closer. The light was the dimmest we'd encountered. Cortland stopped at the edge of the amphitheater and turned to face me. "I found the stone line 3 weeks after the recovery," she said. "I came back the following week to investigate further, and I walked downstream to this point. This is what I found." She pointed toward the island in the center of the creek. I looked. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just moss, dark soil, a few small hemlocks growing from the higher ground at the island's center. Then Cortland walked closer and knelt at the edge of the water. And I followed her sightline to the base of the largest hemlock. Arranged around the trunk, in a circle roughly 6 feet in diameter, were stones. Creek stones, like the ones in the line downstream, but these were different. They'd been placed on end standing upright in the soft soil, each one wedged firmly enough to stay vertical. There were dozens of them. Some were 4 or 5 inches tall, others closer to 8. They varied in color from pale gray to almost black. And they were arranged in a pattern that I recognized, with a jolt, because I'd seen it before, not here, not in the Smokies, but on a map. It was a spiral, a tight, precise spiral that began at the trunk of the hemlock and wound outward in 3 complete turns before terminating at the water's edge. The spacing between the stones was consistent. The curve was smooth. The workmanship, if that's the right word, was careful and deliberate. I stood there looking at it for a long time. "When did you find this?" I asked. "December 28th, 2007, 4 weeks after the recovery. And it wasn't here during the search." The search teams came through this drainage on November 26th through 29th. I was on one of those teams. We walked past this island. There was nothing on it. "Could someone have built this between the recovery and your visit?" "Who?" "No one has any reason to come here. There's no trail, no destination, no camp. And the craftsmanship, look at the soil around the bases. Those stones have been seeded, pushed down into the earth and packed. That's not a casual afternoon's work." I knelt and examined the nearest stone. She was right. It had been pushed into the soil to a depth of roughly 2 inches, and the soil around the base had been compressed and smoothed. I tested it with a gentle push. It was stable. Someone had spent time on this. "There's more," Cortland said. She waded across the shallow channel to the island and walked to the far side, where the second arm of the creek flowed along the southern wall of the amphitheater. I followed. The water was knee-deep and cold enough to ache. On the far side of the island, half hidden by a low curtain of rhododendron, there was a shallow overhang in the rock wall. Not a cave, exactly, but a horizontal recess in the exposed stone, maybe 3 feet high and 6 feet deep. The kind of feature you could walk past 100 times without noticing if the vegetation was dense enough. Inside the overhang, pushed back against the deepest wall, were objects. Cortland pulled out a headlamp and handed it to me. I clicked it on and aimed the beam into the recess. A compass, a GPS unit, a folded topographic map. I felt something go very still inside my chest. "Those are Ethan's," Cortland said. "The serial number on the GPS matches the one signed out to him on November 14th. The compass is his personal Sunto. The map is a park-issue quad with his handwriting on it." I didn't touch them. My investigative training was loud enough in that moment to override everything else. I looked at the objects from outside the overhang, using the headlamp to examine their positions. The GPS was placed face up, screen dark, centered in the recess. The compass was beside it, open, needle pointing north. The map was folded neatly beneath both, like a shelf. "You didn't move these." "I have never touched them. I've been here 4 times. Each time they are exactly as you see them. Same position, same arrangement." "Have you reported this?" "To whom?" "My appeal was denied. I was placed on administrative assignment for, and I'll quote, persistent insubordination related to investigative findings. If I report that I've been conducting unauthorized backcountry visits to a closed case site, I lose my career. If I report that I found the missing navigation equipment arranged in an alcove next to a stone spiral that appeared after the search, I lose my credibility. I needed someone from outside the park to see this. Someone with the authority to document it without going through the people who closed the case." She said all of this with the same measured precision she'd used in her letter. No tremor, no desperation, just a clear-eyed assessment of the institutional physics she was operating within. I turned off the headlamp and stepped back from the overhang. The amphitheater was very quiet. The creek made almost no sound where it split around the island. The canopy overhead was so dense that I couldn't see sky, just layers of dark green filtered through more dark green, receding upward into shadow. "Dana," I said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Ask." "Is there any possibility at all, that you placed those items here?" She looked at me, not with offense, with something more complicated. "If I had placed them here," she said, "I wouldn't have needed to bring you 4 miles into the backcountry to show you. I would have simply told you where they were and let a forensics team recover them. The reason I brought you here is that I need a witness, someone with credentials and no connection to the park who can confirm what's in that alcove before I take this to anyone else." It was a fair answer, more than fair. It was strategic, and it told me that Cortland had spent months thinking not just about what she'd found, but about the evidentiary chain that would be necessary to make anyone believe her. I photographed everything: the stone line downstream, the spiral around the hemlock, the overhang and its contents. I took wide shots and close-ups, included my field notebook in the frame for scale, and recorded the GPS coordinates from my own unit. I wrote detailed notes describing the position, condition, and arrangement of every object. I worked slowly and methodically, the way I'd been trained, while Cortland watched without comment. When I finished, I looked at my watch. We had about 2 hours of usable daylight left, and the hike back to the trailhead was 4 miles uphill through steep terrain. "We need to head back," I said. "I know." I expected her to start walking. She didn't. She stood at the edge of the island, looking downstream, past the amphitheater, into the deeper drainage beyond. "The first time I came here," she said, "after I found the spiral, I went further downstream, another 1/4 mile. The drainage gets very narrow slot width in places, maybe 6 feet between the walls. The creek fills the entire floor. You have to wade." "What did you find?" "More stones. Not lines, not spirals. Individual stones, placed on ledges in the rock walls, one every 30 or 40 feet, like markers. Marking what? A direction. They lead further into the drainage. I followed them for about 10 minutes before the light got too low and the water got too deep. I turned around. And you haven't gone back. Not past the amphitheater, not alone. There was nothing dramatic in the way she said it. No lowered voice, no significant pause. She stated it the way you'd state that you hadn't crossed a river because the water was too high. A practical assessment. But underneath it, I heard something I recognized, the particular restraint of a person who is experienced enough to be afraid for precise reasons rather than vague ones. We hiked out. The climb back was hard on my knees and harder on my lungs. I'd been riding a desk for 5 months, and the Smokies were reminding me of it. Cortland moved steadily ahead of me, offering occasional route guidance without condescension, holding rhododendron branches so they wouldn't snap back. Professional courtesy between two people who understood terrain. We reached the trailhead just as the last direct light left the canopy. The parking area was empty, except for our vehicles. The evening air had a bite to it, that late April mountain chill that arrives the moment the sun drops behind a ridge. At the trucks, I told Cortland what I planned to do. I would return to my motel, write up my field notes, and review the photographs. In the morning, I would visit the park's administrative office and request access to the original search records, the radio logs, the GPS tracks from the search teams, the dog handler's notes, and the FLIR data from the helicopter passes. If the records supported what she'd shown me, I would contact Len in Norfolk and recommend that the case be formally reopened under our unit's authority. "And if the records don't support it?" she asked. "Then I'll need to understand why." She nodded slowly. Then she said something that stayed with me. "The incident report says Ethan got lost. His GPS says he didn't, because it's not on his body, it's in a rock alcove, placed there by someone who wanted it found. His compass says he didn't because it's right next to it. His map says he didn't because he didn't need a map for that country. He'd been walking it since he was 12. Everything that could prove he knew exactly where he was going has been removed from his body and arranged in a location where no one would look unless someone told them to. The report doesn't describe a man who got lost. It describes a man whose ability to prove he wasn't lost was taken from him after he died." She got in her truck and drove away. I sat in the parking lot for a long time before I started the engine. And the motel was in Bryson City, a small place called the Smoky View that was clean and quiet and had the kind of mattress that reminded you exactly how old your back was. I sat at the desk and wrote up my notes for an hour, then spread the photographs across the bed and studied them. The stone line. 19 stones, evenly spaced, parallel to the water line, like a boundary or a margin, the spiral. Dozens of stones standing upright in soil, wound in 3 precise turns around a hemlock trunk. Patient work, careful work, work that required sustained attention and a plan. The navigation equipment in the overhang, centered, arranged. The compass open and pointing north as if it had been placed there by someone who understood what it was and wanted it to remain functional. I kept coming back to the compass. A closed compass is storage. An open compass is use. Whoever placed it in that alcove had opened it and oriented it. That's not the behavior of someone disposing of evidence. That's the behavior of someone making a display. The next morning, I drove to the park's administrative office at the Okonalufte Visitor Center and presented my credentials. The staff were polite but cautious. A review from an interagency investigation unit, even a small one, carries a particular institutional frequency, not hostile, but not comfortable either. Nobody likes being checked. I was assigned a liaison, a supervisory ranger named Paul Dressler, who had been in the Smokies for 8 years and had been peripherally involved in the Harkin search as a logistics coordinator. Dressler was in his mid-40s, solidly built, with a neatly trimmed beard and the practiced affability of someone who had spent significant time managing both terrain and people. He installed me in a conference room with a table, a lamp, and boxes. The boxes contained the complete search record. I'll spare you the full inventory. What I spent the next 2 days reading amounted to roughly 400 pages of operational documentation. Daily search plans, team assignments, GPS track logs, radio transcripts, aircraft logs, dog handler reports, medical examiners' findings, evidence recovery forms, and interagency communications. Most of it was consistent with what I'd already read in the incident report. The search had been conducted professionally. The teams were experienced. The documentation was thorough. Ethan Harkin had been found in Stillhouse branch drainage in a position consistent with a person who had lain down and not gotten up. The medical examiner's finding of hypothermia was reasonable, given the conditions. Nighttime temperatures in mid-November at that elevation would have been in the mid-20s to low 30s. And Harkin had been found in his base layers. His jacket had been on, but unzipped. His boots were on. No signs of trauma, no signs of struggle. A man who had gone to sleep and not woken up. But buried in the operational details, I found 3 things that weren't in the summary report. The first was in the dog handler's notes. The handler, a specialist named Rita Coswell, who worked with a bloodhound named Amos, had documented the live scent trail leading from Harkin's pack to the creek crossing where the trail was lost. Standard procedure when a trailing dog loses scent at water is to cast both upstream and downstream to determine which direction the subject went. Coswell had done this. Amos had cast downstream for approximately 300 yards without picking up the scent. Then Coswell brought him back and cast upstream. Amos had refused to go upstream. Coswell's notes described it simply. Dog showed strong avoidance behavior when directed upstream of crossing point. Pulled hard toward downstream cast. Refused to track upstream after 3 attempts. Handler did not force. Dog handlers are careful with their language. They don't say a dog refused unless the refusal was unambiguous. And a trained bloodhound doesn't refuse a track unless something about the track environment is aversive. Not the scent itself, the environment. I flagged the page and moved on. The second finding was in the GPS track logs from the search teams. Each team carried a GPS unit that recorded their path. On the 4th day of the search, the day the scent trail was discovered and the search expanded southeast, a 3-person team had been assigned to work the Stillhouse branch drainage, from downstream to upstream, opposite the direction Cortland and I had traveled. Their GPS track showed them entering the drainage, proceeding upstream for approximately 1 mile, and then stopping. The track showed them stationary for 47 minutes. Then it showed them turning around and leaving the drainage the way they'd come. Their daily report noted that the drainage had become impassable due to high water and dense vegetation, and that they had determined the terrain was too difficult to continue without specialized equipment. They recommended that the drainage be covered by helicopter instead. I cross-referenced this with the weather data. It hadn't rained in 4 days. Creek levels would have been dropping, not rising. And the vegetation, hemlock and rhododendron, wouldn't have changed in any meaningful way between seasons. If the drainage was passable on November 14th when Harkin walked into it, it was passable on November 18th when the search team turned around. Something had stopped them. Their report said terrain. The data said the terrain hadn't changed. I flagged this too. The third finding was the most significant, and it was in the FLIR records. The helicopter had made multiple passes over the search area during the 17-day operation. FLIR forward-looking infrared detects heat signatures, which is how they eventually located Harkin's body. The aircraft's data had been downloaded and archived as part of the standard record. Most of the FLIR imagery was unremarkable. Occasional deer, a bear, the search teams themselves showing as bright shapes against the cool forest. But on the November 27th pass, 3 days before the body was found, the FLIR data showed something in Stillhouse Branch that I couldn't immediately explain. The image was taken from approximately 800 feet above the drainage, looking straight down. The creek was visible as a dark line. Water, being cooler than the surrounding ground, shows dark on thermal imaging. The forest canopy was a uniform field of cool greens and blues. Normal, except for one area. In the amphitheater, the same bowl-shaped depression where Cortland had shown me the stone spiral, there was a thermal signature roughly 10 feet in diameter that was significantly warmer than anything around it. Not the intense white of a campfire or a large animal. More subtle. A soft, diffuse warmth. Centered on the island where the creek split, the FLIR operator had annotated it. Possible thermal spring or underground seepage. No further investigation recommended. I pulled up the geological survey data for the Southern Smokies. There were no thermal springs in the Stillhouse Branch drainage. There were no thermal springs anywhere in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The entire range is underlain by metamorphic rock, primarily sandstone and slate, with no volcanic or geothermal activity within hundreds of miles. The FLIR image had been taken 3 days before the body was found. The body was recovered approximately 2 miles downstream from the amphitheater. The thermal anomaly was on the island. The stone spiral was on the island. Harkin's navigation equipment was in the alcove 30 feet from the island. I sat in the conference room with the FLIR printout in my hands, and I felt the case change shape beneath me. Dressler knocked on the door around 4 that afternoon. He'd been checking in periodically, bringing coffee, asking if I needed anything, performing the role of cooperative host with practiced ease. This time he sat down. "Finding what you need?" he asked. "I'm finding things that raise questions." That's natural with a complex search. "Paul, I need to ask you about the search team that entered Stillhouse Branch from the downstream end on November 18th. 3-person team. They stopped approximately 1 mile in and turned around." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not much. A recalibration. "I'd have to check the team assignments," he said. "I have them." The team lead was a ranger named Foley. The report says they turned back due to impassable terrain and high water. If that's what the report says. It hadn't rained in 4 days. Dressler was quiet for a moment. Mountain drainages can hold water longer than you'd expect. Subsurface flow, seepage, saturated soil. The conditions on the ground don't always match the weather record. That was true in general. It was not true for Stillhouse Branch in late November. The drainage was narrow, steep-walled, and rocky. Water would move through it fast, not linger. "The team was stationary for 47 minutes before turning around," I said. "That's a long time to stand in one place deciding whether the terrain is passable." People rest, they eat, they discuss options. During an active search for a missing ranger, Dressler's affability thinned, not into hostility, into something more careful. "I'll see if Foley is available to talk to you," he said. "He's still on staff." "I'd appreciate that." He left. I went back to the FLIR data. That evening, back at the motel, I called Len in Norfolk. I told him what Cortland had shown me and what I'd found in the records. He listened without interrupting, which was his way of telling me he was taking it seriously. "The navigation equipment in the alcove," he said when I finished. "That changes things. It changes everything." The incident report's primary explanation for Harkin's disorientation is the loss of his navigation tools. If those tools weren't lost, if they were deliberately placed in a specific location, then the entire finding collapses. Could Cortland have placed them? She could have. But the scenario doesn't hold. If she planted evidence, she'd want it found through official channels, not through a private visit with an outside investigator. Planting evidence and then bypassing the chain of custody doesn't serve any strategic purpose. Unless she's playing a longer game. She's been playing the longest game I've seen. She spent 6 months fighting her own institution through proper channels before this file ever reached us. That's not the behavior of someone manufacturing evidence. That's the behavior of someone who has evidence and can't get anyone to look at it. Len was quiet for a while. I could hear him thinking, which sounds like nothing but carries a particular weight over a phone line when you've known someone long enough. "I'll authorize an extension," he said. 10 days. If you determine the case warrants reopening, we'll file the paperwork jointly. But I want photographs of everything, chain of custody documentation for any physical evidence, and written statements from any witness you interview. Do this clean. Understood? And Ashcroft, the thermal anomaly. I know. Don't go looking for explanations that aren't there. But don't ignore the ones that are. The next morning, I asked Dressler to arrange a meeting with Foley. He told me Foley was on a backcountry assignment and wouldn't be available for 3 days. I asked for the name of the FLIR operator. He said the aircraft had been contracted from a private company and the operator's name would have to be obtained through procurement records. Everything was cooperative. Nothing was fast. I drove back to the Deep Creek trailhead alone. I want to be clear about why I went back alone. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't impatience. It was the simple professional reality that I had 10 days. That Dressler's cooperation was slowing to the speed of institutional resistance, and that the physical evidence in Stillhouse Branch was exposed to weather, animals, and anyone else who might walk through. Every day I waited was a day the evidence degraded. I left a note at the front desk of the motel with my planned route, my expected return time, and Cortland's phone number as an emergency contact. I carried a radio, a GPS, a first aid kit, and enough water for a full day. I was not being reckless. I was being efficient with a closing window. The morning was overcast, mid-50s, with a ceiling of gray cloud that sat on the ridges like a hand pressing down. The forest was quiet in the way forests get before rain, not silent, but muted. As if everything with wings or legs had read the barometer and decided to stay close to shelter, I made good time on the maintained trail. At the junction, I turned southeast and descended into the drainage, following the same route Cortland had led me 2 days earlier. The rhododendron was thicker than I remembered, or maybe I was just more aware of it, without another person ahead of me, parting the branches. By the time I reached the bench above Stillhouse Branch, my sleeves were wet from brushing through leaves, and my breath was working harder than I wanted to admit. The stone line was still there. 19 stones, evenly spaced, parallel to the water. I photographed it again from multiple angles, then continued downstream toward the amphitheater. The drainage felt different alone. That's not remarkable. Every experienced backcountry traveler knows that the presence or absence of another person fundamentally changes the way you perceive a landscape. With a partner, you're in a conversation, even if nobody's talking. The shared attention distributes the weight of observation across 2 nervous systems. Alone, you carry all of it yourself. and the forest gets louder in proportion. But this was more than that. As I moved deeper into the drainage, past the point where the creek quieted and the water darkened and the hemlock canopy closed overhead, I became aware of something I hadn't noticed with Cortland. A sound. Or rather, the structured absence of sound. In a normal forest, silence has texture. There are layers to it: wind in the upper canopy, insects at ground level, the intermittent calls of birds, the background hiss of moving water, the ticking of branches. Even when a forest seems quiet, if you stand still and listen, you'll hear dozens of individual sounds assembling into a composite that your brain processes as silence. In the lower section of Stillhouse Branch, the composite was wrong. The layers were present. I could hear the creek. I could hear the occasional drip of moisture from the canopy, but there was something underneath all of it, a low, steady tone that I initially mistook for blood pressure in my ears. The kind of sound you become aware of only when you stop moving and stop breathing and listen with your whole body. I stopped. I held my breath. I listened. It was there, barely. A sustained tone, very low in pitch, below what I'd normally associate with any biological source. Not mechanical, not rhythmic, just constant, like a note being held by something with unlimited breath. I stood listening for perhaps 2 full minutes. The tone didn't change. It didn't fluctuate. It simply persisted, right at the threshold of perception, as if it had always been there, and I had only just become still enough to hear it. I moved on. The amphitheater was as we'd left it, the spiral of upright stones around the hemlock, the overhang on the far wall. I waded across to the island and checked the alcove. Harkin's GPS, compass, and map were undisturbed. Same positions, same arrangement. I spent 20 minutes documenting everything with fresh photographs, noting the time and conditions. Then I stood on the island and looked downstream, into the deeper drainage that Cortland had described, the narrow section where she'd found individual stones placed on ledges in the rock walls. The slot-width passage began about 40 yards past the amphitheater. The creek filled the entire floor, running slow and dark between walls of exposed rock that rose 8 or 10 feet on either side. The passage wasn't impassable. The water was perhaps knee-deep, and the current was mild, but it was constricted. The kind of terrain where you feel the mountain's weight above you in a way that open forest never produces. I entered the passage. The light dropped immediately. The walls were close enough that I could touch both sides simultaneously if I stretched my arms. The water was colder here than anywhere upstream noticeably. Sharply colder, enough that I felt it through my boots and pants within the first 30 seconds. The rock on either side was dark, fine-grained, layered in thin horizontal bands that looked almost sedimentary despite the metamorphic geology. And there were the stones. Cortland had described them accurately. Individual creek stones, palm-sized, placed on natural ledges in the rock walls. One every 30 to 40 feet, alternating sides: left wall, right wall, left wall, right wall. Each stone was placed flat, centered on its ledge, positioned at roughly eye height. They were impossible to mistake for natural placement. A stone doesn't come to rest on a narrow rock ledge 4 feet above the waterline without hands. I counted them as I walked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. After the 7th stone, the passage bent to the left and widened slightly into a small chamber. Not the amphitheater, something different. More enclosed. The walls were higher here, maybe 15 feet, and the canopy overhead was so tight that the light was reduced to a greenish glow, that made my headlamp necessary even though it was mid-morning. The creek pooled in this chamber. The current effectively stopped. The water was perhaps 3 feet deep, clear in the shallows near the walls, but darkening to opacity in the center, where the bottom dropped away. I couldn't tell how deep the center was. My headlamp beam entered the water and simply dissolved, the way light disappears into ink. On the far wall of the chamber, above the waterline, there was a flat section of rock roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. Smooth, lighter in color than the surrounding walls, almost like a panel. And on that panel, someone had made marks. I waded closer. The water reached my thighs, then my waist. The cold was severe, a deep, penetrating cold that felt less like temperature and more like pressure, as if the water were physically pushing against my skin. I kept moving. The marks were scratched into the rock surface. Not deeply, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, but clearly, with deliberate strokes. They were arranged in vertical columns, thus 3 columns, each containing rows of short horizontal lines. Tally marks. I counted the first column. 23 marks, arranged in standard groups of 5, 4 vertical strokes, crossed by a 5th diagonal. The second column contained 17. The third contained 11. 51 total. I stared at them. The rock surface was hard metamorphic slate or something close to it. Scratching marks this clean into that material would require a hard tool and sustained effort. A knife blade, a rock hammer, something with a point. 51 marks. 23, 17, 11. The numbers didn't immediately correspond to anything. Not days, not distances, not coordinates. I wrote them down in my field notebook, holding the book above the waterline and writing with numb fingers. Then I noticed something else. Below the 3 columns, near the waterline, there was a 4th set of marks. These were different, not tally marks, lines, but arranged in a pattern that didn't match the others. Short vertical strokes of varying heights, some close together, some spaced apart, with occasional horizontal connections between them. It took me almost a minute to recognize what I was looking at. It was a topographic profile, a simplified cross-section of terrain, drawn the way a surveyor or a geologist would draw it. Peaks represented by taller lines, valleys by shorter ones, ridges by connected horizontals. It was rough, schematic, but unmistakable once you saw it. And I recognized the profile. It was the ridge visible from the amphitheater, looking south. The same ridge I'd seen through the gap in the canopy when standing on the island. The peaks matched. The saddle between them matched. The relative heights matched. Someone had stood in this chamber, chest deep in dark water, and scratched a view of the landscape onto the rock wall. I took photographs. My hands were shaking, and not entirely from the cold. The headlamp beam jumped with each exposure, but I was deliberate. I took 12 shots from different angles, including close-ups of the tally marks and the terrain profile. I recorded the GPS coordinates. I noted the water depth, the temperature by sensation, the light conditions, the time. Then I backed out of the chamber the way I'd come in. The passage felt longer on the return. That's normal, unfamiliar terrain, always seems shorter on the way out. But narrow terrain reverses the effect because you're moving against the direction of your own anxiety. I counted the marker stones on the way back. 7. Same positions, same spacing. I emerged into the amphitheater and stood on the island for several minutes, letting my body heat stabilize and my heart rate return to something reasonable. The low tone was still present, that barely perceptible sustained sound that I'd noticed on the way in, standing still. In the quietest part of the drainage, it was more distinct. Not louder, more present. As if the amphitheater were a resonant space and the tone were tuned to it. I checked my watch. I'd been in the drainage for just over 3 hours. The overcast had thickened, and the light was dimmer than when I'd arrived. I needed to start the climb out. But before I left, I did something that I had not planned to do. Something that, in retrospect, may have changed everything that followed. I took one of the marker stones from the wall. My reasoning at the time was straightforward. I needed physical evidence. Photographs could be challenged, digital manipulation, misidentification, pareidolia. A stone removed from the wall, documented in situ and transported with chain of custody protocols, was material proof that someone had placed objects in this drainage. If I was going to argue that the Harkin case should be reopened, I needed something you could hold in your hand. It was the 4th stone in the sequence. Left wall, approximately 4 feet above the waterline, resting on a natural ledge. I photographed it in place, noted the coordinates, then lifted it with both hands and placed it in a plastic evidence bag from my kit. The stone was warm, not sun-warm. The walls of the passage received no direct sunlight, not friction warm. It had been sitting motionless on a ledge, just warm, in the way that living skin is warm, a radiant heat that I felt through the plastic bag and that persisted as I carried it out of the passage and across the amphitheater and up the drainage toward the bench. I hiked out with the stone in my pack. The climb was harder than the descent. My legs were cold from the wading. My clothes were wet below the waist, and the overcast was starting to produce a fine mist that made the rhododendron leaves drip and the trail surfaces slick. I focused on footing and breathing and tried not to think about the warmth against my back. At the trailhead, I sat in the truck with the heater running for 10 minutes before I drove. I took the evidence bag out of my pack and set it on the passenger seat. The stone was still warm. I held my hand an inch above it and felt the heat radiating upward, gentle and steady, like an object that had been sitting in a sunbeam for hours. The ambient temperature outside was 48 degrees. The stone had been submerged in creek water and carried through cold air for over an hour. It should not have been warm. Back at the motel, I placed the stone, still in its bag, on the desk and wrote up my field notes. I documented everything: the passage, the marker stones, the chamber, the tally marks, the terrain profile, the water depth and temperature, the stone's thermal anomaly. I worked for 2 hours. When I finished, I placed my hand on the evidence bag. The stone was cool, room temperature, as if nothing had ever been unusual about it. I called Cortland. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I'd found: the chamber, the marks, the terrain profile. I told her about the stone. She listened the way she always listened, with a silence that carried its own gravity. "You went past where I stopped," she said. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "The tally marks: 23, 17, 11. 51 total. I can't connect the numbers to anything in the file. Ethan's patrol number was 23. The room went very still. "What?" "Each backcountry ranger is assigned a patrol number for radio identification. Ethan's was 23, mine is 17. I sat down on the bed. "And 11? "I don't know. I'd have to check the roster." "Check it." "I will. But you need to understand what you're describing. Those numbers, if they're patrol numbers, they weren't scratched into rock by Ethan. Ethan was found 2 miles downstream, and they weren't scratched by me. because I've never been in that chamber. Someone else then. Someone who knows Park Service patrol number assignments. Or someone who was with Harkin when he went into that drainage. Another long silence. I could hear her thinking, the same way I could hear Len thinking, silence with architecture. "Ranger Ashcroft," she said. "The stone you removed. Where is it now?" "On my desk, sealed in an evidence bag." "And the temperature?" "It was warm when I took it, warm through the bag, warm during the entire hike out. It cooled down within 2 hours of being in this room." She didn't respond to that directly. Instead, she said, "I need to tell you something I didn't include in my letter. Something I didn't tell the regional office or the superintendent or anyone involved in the official review." "Tell me." "The night before Ethan went missing, he called me. It was late after 11. He sounded not frightened, exactly. Focused, intense. He told me he'd been studying the topographic maps of the Stillhouse Branch drainage for several weeks. He said there was a feature in the lower drainage that didn't match any geological survey. A depression or a chamber that appeared on some maps and not on others, depending on the survey year. He said he'd found historical references to the drainage in park archives, handwritten notes from CCC-era trail crews in the 1930s, that described the area as avoided. Not closed, not restricted, avoided. The crews had been assigned to build a trail through it and had simply not done so, without any documented reason. He was planning to go there. He asked me to come with him. Not on the 14th. He knew I was assigned elsewhere that day. He wanted to go together on our next shared patrol day, which would have been the 18th. He wanted a partner. But he went alone on the 14th instead. I've spent 6 months asking myself why. The only answer I have is that he found something in the archives that made him unwilling to wait. What kind of something? I don't know. He didn't tell me. He said he'd show me on the 18th. The last thing he said to me was, "Dana, I think it answers back." The phrase sat in the room between us and the phone line and did not go away. "Answers back," I repeated. His exact words. And then he said good night. And the next morning, he drove to the trailhead and walked into the drainage and never walked out. I didn't sleep well that night. The motel room was warm, the bed was adequate, and I was tired enough that sleep should have come easily. But I kept turning over Cortland's final revelation and matching it against the physical evidence, and finding that the two illuminated each other in ways that made the darkness deeper rather than lighter. Harkin had gone into Stillhouse Branch deliberately, looking for something he believed was responsive. His navigation equipment had been removed from his body and placed in an alcove near a stone spiral that appeared after the search. Marker stones had been placed along the passage leading deeper into the drainage. Tally marks in a hidden chamber corresponded to Park Service patrol numbers, including the number of a ranger who had never been inside the chamber. And a stone removed from the passage wall had retained warmth that it could not, by any physical principle I understood, have possessed. The official report said he got lost. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered said that getting lost was the one thing Ethan Harkin had not done. The next morning, I went back to the administrative office. Dressler met me in the conference room with his usual coffee and his usual cooperative smile. I asked him 2 things. First, I asked for the patrol number roster from November 2007. He provided it without hesitation. A simple spreadsheet listing every backcountry ranger and their assigned 2-digit patrol number. Harkin was 23. Cortland was 17. I scanned the list for 11. Patrol number 11 was assigned to a seasonal ranger named Marcus Ober. "Is Ober still with the park?" I asked. Dressler's expression didn't change. Marcus left the service in February 2008. 3 months after Harkin's death. People leave for all kinds of reasons. Where is he now? I wouldn't have that information. The second thing I asked for was access to the park's historical archives. Specifically, any documentation related to Stillhouse Branch from the Civilian Conservation Corps era. Dressler's cooperativeness, which had been operating at a steady simmer for 3 days, dropped by several degrees. That would be in the park historian's collection, he said. It's not centrally indexed. A search like that could take weeks. I have 7 days. I understand. But I can't pull a historian off their current projects for a review of a closed case. The case may not remain closed. He looked at me. The cooperative smile was gone. What replaced it wasn't unfriendly, it was careful. The expression of a man who has just realized that the visitor he's been managing might be harder to manage than anticipated. "I'll see what I can find," he said. And then, as if it were an afterthought, "You've been spending time in the field." "I have." "Alone?" "Investigative prerogative." "Of course. I just recommend caution. The southern drainages can be unpredictable this time of year. We've had incidents with flash flooding even in dry periods. Water comes off the ridges fast." It was a reasonable thing to say. Every word of it was factually accurate, and every word of it felt like a fence being built while I watched. "I appreciate the concern," I said. That afternoon, while Dressler was presumably looking into the archive request, I drove to the Cherokee Ranger Station on the eastern side of the park and asked to speak with anyone who had worked with Marcus Ober. It took 3 conversations with 3 different rangers before I found someone who remembered him, a maintenance supervisor named Helen Yancey, who had overlapped with Ober for 1 season. "Marcus was quiet," she said. "Not shy, quiet. The kind of person who watches more than he talks. Good ranger, thorough. I was surprised when he left." "Did he give a reason?" "Not to me. He just didn't come back after the winter break. I heard later he'd submitted his resignation by mail." "By mail?" "That's what I heard. No exit interview, no forwarding address." "Did you know he was assigned patrol number 11? She thought about it. "That sounds right. He was working the southern backcountry that fall, same as Harkin. They overlapped." "Did they patrol together?" "Sometimes. The southern routes are long, and the superintendent encouraged partnered patrols when staffing allowed. Marcus and Ethan were out together a few times that I know of." "Was Marcus part of the search when Harkin went missing?" She paused. "You know, I'm not sure. I wasn't on the search team, but I remember Marcus being around during those weeks. Quiet, quieter than usual, which is saying something." "Did he ever mention Stillhouse Branch?" Helen Yancey looked at me. Something moved behind her eyes, not recognition exactly, but the shadow of a thing she hadn't thought about in a long time. "No," she said. "But Ethan did." "What did he say?" "It was maybe 2 weeks before he went missing. We were in the break room at Oconaluftee. Ethan was looking at a map, a big topo spread out on the table, and I asked him what he was working on. He said he was trying to find a drainage that didn't want to be found." She said it lightly. It had been a light moment, a passing exchange in a break room over coffee. She hadn't thought about it since. "I laughed," she said. "I thought he was joking." He smiled, but he didn't laugh. And then Marcus walked in, and Ethan folded up the map. The look on her face as she recalled this told me she was hearing the exchange differently for the first time. "He folded it up when Marcus came in," I said. "Yes, like he didn't want Marcus to see what he was looking at." I drove back to Bryson City through a light rain that turned the mountains into gray shapes and made the road shine like something wet and alive. I kept thinking about the number 11, scratched into rock in a chamber that Ethan Harkin had died 2 miles from, and that Dana Cortland had never entered. Marcus Ober's number, inscribed in stone in a place that no official record acknowledged, and that the search teams had turned away from. Either Marcus Ober had been inside that chamber, or someone who knew his patrol number had been. And this was the thought that I kept pushing away, and that kept returning something that had encountered both Harkin and Ober, had recorded what it learned. I spent the evening at the motel, trying to reach Ober. I called the Park Service Personnel Office and learned that his resignation letter had provided a home address in Knoxville, but no phone number. I called directory assistance for Knoxville and found no listing for a Marcus Ober. I called Len in Norfolk and asked him to run a records check, a driver's license, tax filings, anything that would produce a current address. Len said he'd have something for me within 48 hours. Then I went back to the evidence bag on the desk. The stone was room temperature. Unremarkable. A piece of dark, fine-grained slate, slightly flattened, slightly oblong, fitting comfortably in one hand. The kind of stone a creek produces by the millions, smoothed, shaped, anonymized by water until it looks like every other stone in the bed. I picked it up and held it. Nothing. Cool, inert. I put it back in the bag and went to bed. At 2:40 in the morning, I woke up because the room was wrong. Not a sound, not a temperature change, something more fundamental. The quality of the air, the weight of the silence, the way the darkness in the room seemed to have rearranged itself around a center of gravity that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. I lay still for a long time. My eyes were open. The room was dark except for the red glow of the alarm clock and a faint line of parking lot light under the curtain. Everything was in its place: the desk, the chair, the evidence bag, the scattered papers. Nothing had moved. But the stone was warm. I could feel it. Not through contact. I was 6 feet away in bed. I could feel it the way you feel a wood stove from across a room, a radiant presence that the air carried to my skin. Gentle, steady, unmistakable. I got up. I walked to the desk. I placed my hand above the evidence bag. Heat. Clear, clean heat, rising from the stone through the plastic, warming my palm from 6 inches away. I picked up the bag. The stone was hot. Not burning, I could hold it, but significantly warmer than anything in that room had any reason to be. I estimated the surface temperature at 110, maybe 115 degrees. I held it for perhaps 30 seconds. The heat was constant, not fading, not building, just present, like the stone had a metabolic rate. Then I set it back on the desk and stood in the dark room, in a motel in Bryson City, North Carolina, at 2:40 in the morning, and acknowledged to myself that I was holding evidence that did not belong to any category of experience I had built in 53 years of living. The stone cooled over the next hour. I sat in the chair and watched it not with instruments, just with my hand held above it at intervals, tracking the heat as it diminished. By 3:45, it was warm. By 4:15, it was tepid. By the time the first gray light came through the curtain, it was room temperature again. And if I hadn't been awake to feel it, I would never have known. I didn't tell Cortland about the stone's behavior that night. Not immediately. I needed to think about what I was carrying and what it meant for the investigation before I added another variable to a situation that was already exceeding its container. What I did that morning was something more practical. I went to a hardware store in Bryson City and bought a digital infrared thermometer the kind contractors use to check insulation and HVAC systems. $37. It measured surface temperature from a distance of 12 inches with an accuracy of plus or minus 2 degrees. I took it back to the motel, calibrated it against the room thermostat, and shot the stone. 71 degrees, room temperature, dead match for every other surface in the room. I logged the reading, the time, the ambient conditions. Then I packed the thermometer, the stone, and my field kit, and drove to the park. Dressler was waiting for me at the administrative office. He had two things. The first was a message that Ranger Foley, the team lead who had entered Stillhouse Branch from downstream and turned around, was available to speak with me that afternoon at the Cades Cove maintenance facility on the Tennessee side. This was a 90-minute drive from Bryson City, which struck me as inconvenient in a way that might or might not have been deliberate. The second was a cardboard file box. Inside it were photocopied pages from the park historian's collection, loosely organized and clearly assembled in haste. Dressler set it on the conference table with the manner of a man completing an obligation. "This is what we found related to Stillhouse Branch," he said. "It isn't much." He was right. It wasn't much. But what was there was significant. The box contained 11 pages of handwritten work logs from a civilian Conservation Corps crew assigned to the Southern Smokies in 1934. The crew, designated Company 414, had been tasked with constructing a network of fire trails connecting the major drainages on the North Carolina side of the park. The logs documented daily progress: miles cleared, grades established, drainage crossings built, standard infrastructure work, recorded in the cramped, practical handwriting of young men doing hard labor in remote country. The entries covering Stillhouse Branch were dated September 8th through September 14th, 1934. On September 8th, the crew foreman, identified only as JTM, noted that the advance team had reached the upper drainage and begun clearing a road along the south bank. Work proceeded normally for 2 days. On September 10th, the entry read, "Crew reports unusual conditions, lower drainage. Cold water, poor light. Men reluctant to proceed. Foreman inspected. Concur conditions unfavorable. Route diverted to ridge above." September 11th. 2 men returned to lower drainage to retrieve equipment left yesterday. Found tools arranged in a manner inconsistent with where they were placed. Saws and axes repositioned along the creek bank in a line. No animal or person responsible. Foreman ordered no further entry. September 12th. Requested guidance from Camp Superintendent regarding Lower Stillhouse. Superintendent advised to bypass drainage entirely and connect trail via Upper Ridge. No explanation provided for the order. September 13th. Crew observed unusual sound from lower drainage during evening meal. Low, continuous tone. Source unknown. Duration approximately 40 minutes. Sound ceased abruptly. September 14th. Trail construction bypassed Stillhouse Branch drainage per standing order. No further entries regarding this area. I read those 6 entries 3 times. Then I sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. 74 years. The phenomenon in Stillhouse Branch had been documented obliquely, in the cautious language of men who had no framework for what they were experiencing 74 years before Ethan Harkin walked into that drainage and didn't walk out. Tools repositioned in a line along the creek bank. Stones placed in a line along the water line. The same behavior, the same organizing principle. Something in that drainage had been arranging objects in deliberate patterns since at least 1934. And a low, continuous tone. Observed by a CCC crew during their evening meal, lasting 40 minutes, ceasing abruptly. The same tone I'd heard standing alone in the drainage 64 years later. I drove to Cades Cove that afternoon to meet Foley. The maintenance facility was a cluster of metal buildings at the end of a service road, populated by mowers, utility vehicles, and the particular atmosphere of a place where practical work happens without fanfare. Ranger Brian Foley was waiting for me in a small office that smelled like chainsaw oil and old coffee. He was in his late 30s, compact, with the kind of permanently sunburned face that comes from years of outdoor work. He shook my hand with a grip that communicated cooperation without enthusiasm. I explained the scope of my review and asked him to walk me through November 18th, 2007, the day his team entered Stillhouse Branch. Foley's account began consistent with his written report. 3-person team entered the drainage from the downstream end at approximately 0900, proceeded upstream through the narrow lower section, moving slowly due to terrain. Water knee-deep in places, walls close, heavy canopy. "How far did you get?" I asked. "About a mile, maybe a little less." "Your GPS shows you were stationary for 47 minutes before turning around." He looked at me. Not with surprise, he'd known this question was coming. With resignation. "We stopped because something wasn't right. The report says high water and dense vegetation." That's what I wrote. "Is that what happened?" Foley rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the wall behind me, then at the floor, then at me. "I've been a ranger for 12 years. I've worked hurricanes, ice storms, bear incidents, technical rescues. I have never written a report that didn't accurately describe what I observed in the field, except that one." "What did you observe?" "We were about a mile in. The drainage had narrowed to maybe 8 feet wide. Creek filling the entire floor. Cold. Dark. And then we came around a bend, and the passage opened up into this, I don't know what to call it. A wider space. A chamber almost. Pool in the center, rock walls on 3 sides. The chamber with the tally marks." He was describing the same space I'd stood in 2 days earlier. "And there were things on the walls," he said. "What kind of things?" "Marks, scratched into the rock, lines and numbers, organized, deliberate, and a drawing, a profile like a topographic cross-section. We all saw it, all 3 of us." "What did you do?" "We stood there and looked at it for a while, and then—" He paused, chose his words. "The water in the pool started to move." "Move how?" "The surface. It had been still, glass still, which was strange because the creek was feeding into it. There should have been current, but it was flat. And then, while we were standing there, the surface began to rise." "Rise?" "The water level came up. Not fast, slow, like someone was filling a bathtub from underneath. No change in the creek flow, no rain, no logical reason. The water just started rising, and it was warm." "You felt the temperature change?" "We were standing in it. The water around our legs had been cold, painfully cold. That drainage is like standing in snowmelt. And then it got warm. Not hot, warm, like bath water, over the course of maybe 2 minutes." "What did your team do?" "Tyler, one of my team, said we should get out. I didn't disagree. We started backing up the way we'd come, and the water kept rising. By the time we were out of the chamber and back in the narrow passage, it was waist-deep where it had been knee-deep when we entered." "That's the high water you reported." "That's the high water I reported. It wasn't weather. It wasn't runoff. The water rose because something made it rise. And it was warm because something made it warm. I couldn't write that. No one would accept that. So I wrote what would be accepted." He said it without apology. the voice of a professional who had made a practical decision and had been living with the cost of it. "The 47 minutes," I said. "You were stationary that long before turning around?" We were trying to understand what we were seeing, and I'll be honest with you, we were trying to work up the nerve to leave, because leaving meant turning our backs on it, and none of us wanted to turn our backs. On the water? On whatever was in the water. I let that sentence exist for a moment before I asked the next question. "Did you see something in the water?" Foley took a long breath. "No, but I felt it. We all did. A presence. That's the only word I have. Something in that pool was aware of us. Not hostile, not threatening, but aware. Paying attention. The way you know when someone is watching you from across a room. Except there was no one there. Just the water, and the marks on the wall, and the feeling that we had walked into someone's house without being invited." I thought about the word Cortland had used. Attentive. Foley had arrived at the same description from the opposite direction of the drainage. "Did you tell anyone what actually happened?" "I told my team to keep their reports consistent with mine. Terrain, high water. They agreed. We never talked about it again." 2 months later, Tyler transferred to Yellowstone. The other team member, Lisa Pratt, is still in the park. We've never discussed it. "And Marcus Ober?" Foley's expression shifted in a way I'd learned to recognize in interviews, the particular tightening that indicates a question has landed closer to something vital than the interviewee expected. "What about Marcus?" "He was assigned to the same section of the park. Patrol number 11. He resigned 3 months after Harkin's death. Do you know anything about that?" Foley was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. "Marcus came to see me," he said finally. "January 2008, about a month after Ethan's body was recovered. He came here to this office, and he sat in that chair you're sitting in. He said he needed to tell someone something, and he thought I might understand, because I'd been in the drainage." "He knew you'd been in the drainage?" "He knew. I don't know how. Maybe the search logs. Maybe he just knew." "What did he tell you?" "He told me he'd been going into Stillhouse Branch for weeks before Ethan died. On his own time, off duty. He said he'd found the same things you're finding: the stones, the marks, the chamber. He said he'd been going deeper than the chamber, into a section of the drainage that narrows further and then opens into something he called a room. Not a chamber, a room. He said the walls were smooth. He said there was no water on the floor. He said the air was warm. And he said there were more marks. Not tally marks, longer markings, complex, covering the walls from floor to ceiling." "Did he describe them?" "He said they looked like maps. Dozens of maps. Drainages, ridgelines, watersheds. Not just this area, regions he didn't recognize. Landscapes that didn't match anything in the Smokies. And among them, and this is when his voice changed. This is when he stopped sounding like a ranger making a report and started sounding like a man who wasn't sure he should be talking. Among them, he said, were maps that weren't of the surface. Not of the surface. That's what he said. He said some of the markings appeared to depict cross-sections of the subsurface. Layers, structures, cavities. Things that shouldn't be visible from inside a drainage because they exist below the rock. And he said those maps were the most detailed, the most carefully made. I sat with that. The room smelled like chainsaw oil. The afternoon light through the small window was turning golder. Did he say anything about Harkin? He said Ethan had followed him. That Ethan had noticed Marcus's pattern, the after-hours visits, the mud on his boots, the preoccupation, and had figured out where he was going. He said he'd warned Ethan not to go alone. He said Ethan had agreed to wait. And then he said the last thing. And it was the last thing he ever said to me, because I never saw him again. What was it? He said it didn't want him to leave, and I don't think he wanted to either. Foley looked at me. His eyes were steady, but the skin around them was tight, and I could see the weight he'd been carrying for months. I told him to resign and go home. I told him that whatever was in that drainage was not his responsibility, and not mine, and not anyone's who didn't have the resources to understand it. He said he wasn't sure that was true. He said it might be specifically his responsibility because he was the one who had gone the deepest. Then he shook my hand and left. And you never reported any of this? To whom? In what framework? With what evidence that wouldn't end my career? I couldn't answer that, because the honest answer was that I didn't know either. I drove back to Bryson City in the dark, the headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the mountain night. And I thought about Marcus Ober sitting in a maintenance office, describing a room where the walls were covered in maps of places that existed below the surface of the earth. I thought about Cortland's careful, devastating letter and the stone spiral that appeared after the search. I thought about the CCC crew in 1934, finding their tools rearranged in a line and hearing a low, continuous tone from the drainage they'd been told to avoid. I thought about a stone in an evidence bag on a motel desk that warmed itself in the middle of the night for reasons that belonged to no physics I had ever studied. And I thought about Ethan Harkin, a young man who had grown up within sight of these mountains, who had recognized that something in a drainage answered back, and who had gone to find it alone because he couldn't bear to wait. I sat in the motel parking lot for a long time before I went inside. The stone was warm. I checked it the moment I walked through the door. I could feel it from across the room, that same radiant, gentle heat, steady and present, like an ember that wouldn't go out. I picked up the infrared thermometer and shot it from 12 inches. 109 degrees. Room ambient, 68. I sat at the desk and placed both hands flat on the surface, flanking the evidence bag, and felt the warmth flowing outward from the stone like a tide. Not pulsing, not fluctuating, constant. A temperature that something was choosing to maintain. I picked up the bag. I held the stone through the plastic, and I spoke to it. I know how that sounds. I know what it suggests about my state of mind at that point. But I was not losing perspective. I was applying logic to evidence. The stone responded to proximity. It responded to removal from the drainage. It responded to darkness and stillness, warming at night and cooling during the day. Everything about its behavior suggested sensitivity to conditions. And if it was sensitive to conditions, then it was possible, not certain, possible that it was sensitive to communication. My name is Ashcroft, I said. I'm investigating the death of Ethan Harkin. I'm trying to understand what happened to him. If you're part of that, if you're connected to whatever is in that drainage, I need you to know that I'm not here to damage it. I'm not here to expose it. I'm here because a man is dead, and his partner deserves an honest answer. The stone's temperature did not change. It did not pulse. It did not glow. It simply continued to be warm, at 109 degrees, in a 68-degree room. As if my words had been received by something that did not speak the same language, but was listening all the same. I set it down. I went to bed. I slept. And in the morning, the stone was cool. Over the next 3 days, I built the case. I obtained Dana Cortland's written statement, 12 pages, single-spaced, covering everything from her professional history with Harkin to the night before his death, to each of her 4 visits to the drainage. I had her sign it in front of a notary in Bryson City. I obtained Brian Foley's statement, 6 pages, detailing his team's actual experience in Stillhouse Branch and his meeting with Marcus Ober. He signed it reluctantly, but without conditions. I think he was relieved to have it on paper after carrying it in silence for a year. I drove to Knoxville and, using the address Len's records check had produced, found Marcus Ober living in a basement apartment near the university. He was thinner than his personnel photo suggested, and his eyes had the particular quality I've seen in people who have experienced something that reorganized their understanding of the world, not haunted, exactly, but recalibrated, permanently alert in a way that isn't the same as anxiety. He spoke to me for 3 hours. He confirmed everything Foley had relayed and added details that Foley hadn't known. The room beyond the chamber, the smooth walls, the warm air, the markings not scratched, he said, not carved, but raised, as if the rock itself had grown them the way a bone grows a callus. Maps of drainages and ridgelines and subsurface structures rendered in stone by a process he had no name for. He told me he had visited the room 11 times over 4 weeks in October and November of 2007. Each time, the markings had changed. Not dramatically incrementally. New lines added. Existing features refined. As if the maps were being updated by an intelligence that was continuously surveying the landscape. He told me that on his 8th visit, he had found a new marking that hadn't been there before, a rendering of the amphitheater, seen from above, with the island and the split creek and the hemlock. And on the island, in the rendering, there was a spiral. The stone spiral that would not physically exist in the amphitheater for another 3 weeks. It showed me what it was going to build, he said, before it built it. I asked him about Harkin. His face changed not with guilt, but with a grief that had aged into something architectural, load-bearing. Ethan figured it out. He watched me. He was smart. He saw the pattern in my schedules, matched it to the drainage maps I'd been studying, and put it together. He confronted me in early November. I told him everything. I told him about the room, the markings, the changes. I told him not to go alone. I told him the drainage responded to individual presence in ways I didn't fully understand, and that it seemed to calibrate itself to whoever was inside it. That what I experienced might not be what he would experience. And he went anyway. He went on the 14th because he found something in the CCC archives that I hadn't seen, a reference to a sealed report from 1934 that described, and this is secondhand. I never saw the report. A CCC worker who entered the lower drainage alone and was found 2 days later sitting in the creek, alive but unresponsive, with his tools arranged around him in a circle. The man was evacuated and never returned to the park. The report was filed and sealed by the camp superintendent. Harkin found a sealed report. He found a reference to one, a file number in the margin of the work logs. He was going to look for the actual document, but he never... Ober stopped, swallowed, continued. He went into the drainage on the 14th because he believed the report would provide context for what I'd been experiencing. He thought understanding the 1934 incident would make his own visit safer. He was wrong. Do you know what happened to him in the drainage? No. I know that his equipment ended up in the alcove. I know his body was found 2 miles downstream. And I know that after the search was over, I went back to the room one last time. The markings had changed again. The map of the amphitheater still showed the spiral. But there was a new symbol I'd never seen before. On the downstream end of the map, near where Ethan was found. I don't know what it represented. It didn't look like a map feature. It looked like... He searched for the word. A notation. An annotation. like someone had marked a location where something happened and wanted it remembered. I asked Ober if he would provide a written statement. He said he would, on one condition: that his statement would be kept within the investigation unit and not shared with the Park Service directly. He said he had no confidence that the institution would do anything constructive with the information, and considerable fear that it would use the information to close the drainage permanently, which, he said, would not protect anyone and might provoke a response from something that had so far been, in his word, patient. I agreed to his condition. He wrote his statement that evening and mailed it to me in Norfolk. On my last day in the park, I went back to Stillhouse Branch one final time. I went alone. I carried the stone. The drainage received me with the same quality I'd felt on every visit: that attentive silence, the muted light, the low sustained tone that existed at the bottom of perception like a foundation note. I walked past the stone line, which was unchanged. I waded to the island and checked the spiral, which was unchanged. I checked the alcove. Harkin's GPS, compass, and map were in their places. I took the stone from my pack. It was warm in my hands. It had been warm since I'd entered the drainage, warming steadily as I descended, as if it recognized where it was. I waded to the wall where I'd taken it from, the fourth ledge on the left. The gap where it had been was still empty, a slight depression in the rock surface marked by a thin line of dried mud. I put it back. I placed it on the ledge, centered it, and took my hands away. The stone sat where it had sat before I'd removed it, flush with the wall, level, part of the sequence. And the tone changed. For the first time since I'd been hearing it, the low sound shifted, not in volume, in pitch. It dropped just slightly, just perceptibly, and then resolved into a lower register that felt less like a single note and more like a chord. Two frequencies, very close together, producing a slow, rhythmic interference pattern that I felt in my sternum more than I heard with my ears. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. And the drainage was simply quiet, in the way that any sheltered mountain hollow is quiet on a spring morning. And the water moved, and the light filtered, and a winter wren sang somewhere in the rhododendron, and everything was ordinary, except for the fact that nothing was ordinary at all. I stood there for a long time. Then I hiked out. I submitted my report to Len 3 weeks later. It ran to 41 pages, including photographs, GPS data, witness statements, archival documentation, and my own field observations. My recommendation was that the case be reopened and that the finding of navigational disorientation be formally vacated. The evidence demonstrated that Harkin had entered Stillhouse Branch deliberately, that his navigation equipment had been removed from his person and placed in a specific location after his death by an unknown agent, and that the drainage contained physical anomalies, thermal, acoustic, structural, that warranted independent scientific investigation. Len read it. He sat with it for 2 days. Then he called me into his office. "This is the most thoroughly documented case file I've reviewed in 30 years, he said. "And it's the one I'm least certain what to do with. Reopen it. And then what? We vacate the finding. We say Harkin didn't get lost. What do we say happened to him? We say we don't know. That's not an answer the family can use. That's not an answer the institution can process. It's the truth." Len looked at me. He was a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the distance between what was true and what was useful, and he understood that the two didn't always share an address. "I'll submit it," he said, "with your recommendation. It'll go to the regional director's office and from there to wherever it goes. But I'll tell you what I think will happen. I think it will be received, reviewed, and filed. I think the finding will stand. And I think Stillhouse Branch will remain exactly what it is, a drainage that nobody visits, in a section of the park that nobody patrols, containing something that nobody understands. He was right. The report was received. It was reviewed. A note was added to the case file acknowledging the existence of additional investigative material. The finding was not changed. Dana Cortland received a copy of my report through a channel I arranged outside the normal distribution. She called me when she'd finished reading it. She didn't say much. She said thank you. She said it mattered that someone had seen what she'd seen and had written it down. She said she was applying for a transfer to a park in the Southwest and that she thought it was time. I asked her about the stone spiral, whether it was still there, whether the alcove still held Harkin's equipment. She said she hadn't been back. I don't need to go back, she said. I needed someone to go there and come out and tell me I wasn't wrong. You did that. The rest of it belongs to whatever it belongs to. Marcus Ober, as far as I know, never returned to the park. His apartment in Knoxville was vacant when I drove past it the following year on an unrelated assignment. The forwarding address he'd left with the Postal Service led to a P.O. box in a small town in the North Carolina Piedmont, 60 miles from the nearest mountains. I didn't pursue him. Some distances are chosen for good reasons. I went back to desk work. My knees improved enough that I returned to the field the following spring, as I'd planned. I served another 11 years before I retired. During that time, I never visited the Great Smoky Mountains again. But I think about Stillhouse Branch. Not constantly, not obsessively. More like the way you think about a room in a house you once visited, a room whose door was open, whose contents you saw clearly, whose purpose you almost but never quite understood. The official report says Ethan Harkin got lost. His navigation equipment, placed with care in a stone alcove by an unknown hand, says otherwise. The marks on the wall say otherwise. The warm stone says otherwise. The low tone that has been sounding in that drainage since at least 1934 says otherwise. The maps growing from rock in a room that a few people have seen and no one has explained say otherwise. I don't know what's in Stillhouse Branch. I don't know if it's geological or biological or something that doesn't fit either word. I don't know whether it meant Ethan Harkin well or ill, or whether those categories even apply to something that thinks in stone and speaks in frequencies below the range of human hearing. I don't know whether Marcus Ober was right that it was patient, and that patience was a quality we should respect rather than test. What I know is that a young man walked into a drainage in the mountains where he'd grown up, looking for something that answered back. And something did answer, and the answer was more than he could carry out. Dana Cortland asked me once whether I believed Harkin had been afraid at the end. I told her what I believed, which is what I'll tell you now. I don't think he was afraid. I think he was the opposite of lost. I think he knew exactly where he was, and what he was near, and what it was showing him. And I think the drainage kept his compass pointing north, and his map folded neatly, and his GPS face up in that alcove, not as evidence and not as a message, but as a record the way you'd preserve the belongings of someone who had arrived somewhere and no longer needed directions. Whether that's a comfort or not, I suppose depends on what you believe about the places we haven't finished understanding. I've thought about it long enough to know that I'll never be done thinking about it. Some questions don't close. They just become part of the terrain you walk through for the rest of your life. Familiar and permanent. Like a drainage on a map that's been there longer than anyone remembers, and that nobody, if they're honest, has ever fully explored.